Good evening, everyone. My name is Amy Skillman, and I'm the director of the MA in Cultural Sustainability at Goucher College. I want to welcome you to the first of 5 webinars in our Spring Chat Fest series of conversations. And this semester, our conversations are really about climate adaptation and its impact on the cultures of the future. So before we begin, I just want to go over a couple of quick reminders. Closed captioning is available. If you want to click on that CC button at the bottom of your page, your screen, you should be able to get closed captioning. We are recording this, so if you don't want to be on screen, please just turn off your video. And we request that you keep your microphone on mute until we get to the question and answer part of our conversation today. And please put your video on speaker view so that you have the speaker front and center. And if a question comes to you before we actually open it up for the Q&A, please feel free to type that in the chat, and either Taylor Seitsinger, who I'll introduce in a minute, and I will make sure that we ask that question at the end. So we call this series our Chat Fest because they're designed really as conversations or chats with some opening remarks by our speakers and then a moderated dialogue or chat. So please feel free, and we encourage you to communicate with each other using the chat function if you like. And if you want, you can begin by just introducing yourself in the chat, say who you are and why you're here. That would be great. So I have to go back and forth here. So as I said, this is the first session in our spring series of online conversations exploring the future of culture, especially in this age of climate adaptation and digital technology. Here you'll see on the screen is a preview of our upcoming virtual conversations. And as I mentioned, Taylor Seitsinger is with us tonight. She's not on screen, but she is here. She's our graduate student admissions counselor for the graduate programs at Goucher College. And I will share both her address, her email address, and mine in a few minutes if you want to reach out to either one of us. But in the meantime, I'm going to ask Taylor to put a link to the registration page for these webinars into the chat, so that if you want, you can go ahead, click into that registration page right now and just register for all the ones that are appealing to you, and that way they're on your calendar. And that will be done. You'll have that done. So our very next session is why cultural sustainability matters. It's next Monday, March 31st. It will be at 6 o'clock instead of 7. And we'll be exploring the question of cultural sustainability. What is it? You can learn a little bit more about our graduate program if in fact you're interested in a graduate program right now. You will meet some alumni, maybe some students and faculty, and it'll be just an opportunity to learn about cultural sustainability. What is a hybrid graduate program? And I think that QR code there should take you to the registration page for that webinar. But Taylor will also put the link to our actual website for the graduate degree if you want to grab that and look at that a little bit later. Now, if you've missed any of our past webinars or are interested in looking at a recording of this webinar, you will be able to access them on our YouTube channel, which is called, interestingly enough, Cultural Sustainability at Goucher College. And there's the link, but I think Taylor will also put that in the chat. so that you can go there and see the recordings of our sessions. And then before I introduce our speaker, I want to share, as I promised, here is here are our email addresses. If you want to reach out to Taylor or if you want to reach out to me, there are the email addresses. Okay, so now on to our program. Oh my gosh, here comes Caitlin Farley. That is really exciting. Uh-oh, did I lose our web? Did I lose the shared screen? I did, I lost the screen. Okay, well, we won't worry about that right now. So some of you may have read this, but a little background on our talk today. New research finds that we've just finished the first year of temperatures beyond 1.5 degrees centigrade warming, and that without radical change, it was the first year of many. But instead of taking urgent action, we're denying climate change exists, or we're saying it's too hard to fix, or we're focusing on the symptoms and not the problem itself. But if climate change spirals out of control, is adaptation really possible? And this is one of the questions that we'll be talking about throughout this series of webinar discussions this semester. What does adaptation really mean? What will a new climate reality do to cultures, to communities, to vulnerable peoples? What is the potential for peoples to make it through the coming polycrisis with their humanity intact? And what steps might we make? What might we take to make that pathway more probable? Our conversation tonight features Erik Assadourian's work to cultivate a philosophy that reconnects people with the living earth. Erik is a sustainability researcher, an eco-philosopher, and director of the Gaian Way, which is an eco-spiritual philosophy, an organization, and a community. From 2001 to 2017, he served as a senior fellow at the World Watch Institute, where he studied cultural change, sustainability education, consumerism, degrowth, ecological ethics, corporate responsibility, religion, and sustainable communities. During that time, he authored and directed several of the Institute's State of the World reports, exploring the impacts of consumerism on communities, culture, and the environment. Erik's writing has been on our reading list in the Cultural Sustainability Program since 2010, and he has served as adjunct professor in our environmental studies master's program, as well as the Cultural Sustainability Program. Moderating our webinar today is Dr. Thomas Walker, an adjunct faculty in both the Cultural Sustainability and the Environmental Sustainability graduate programs. His work focuses on a human dimensions approach to the study of the natural and built environments. He's worked in museums and arts organizations and has documented maritime culture in the Chesapeake Bay as well as in New York Harbor. He has served as a trustee for the Alex C. Walker Foundation, which funds research, policy, and projects investigating environmental economics in areas of climate change, energy, and tax policy, ecosystems, ecotourism, and sustainability in forests and fisheries. Tom is currently teaching our course on culture and calamity, and so a fitting person, I think, to help moderate this conversation. So Tom and Erik, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Okay, well, thanks, Amy, for that introduction. I am really pleased to welcome Erik tonight, friend and colleague, and we have stayed in touch since he moved from Washington to Connecticut. Just wanted to point out that Erik was a sort of, I'd say, a core faculty member when we started the first generation Master of Arts program in environmental studies here at Goucher, and stayed with us right through to the end. And so it especially um, uh, feels good to have him, to welcome him back for this webinar tonight. I think you've covered most of the basics. I don't want to take up too much time, but I did want to just say that Erik is sort of although he taught in the environmental studies program, I think he was familiar to many students through some of the World Watch publications in the cultural sustainability program. So I think of him as a kind of kindred spirit or fellow traveler of cultural sustainability. And he's a visionary, really. And I think he has the unique ability to sort of embrace the scale of cultural sustainability and cultural integrity with what he's going to be talking about today in terms of um, geologic and astral sort of scales of what the planet Earth is going to look like in 1,000 years from now. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to Erik. We'll have some time at the end of his presentation to engage in some conversation and ask questions and have comments and reflect on some of the things he'll be talking about tonight. So, Erik.
Thank you, Tom, and Amy, and Taylor as well. And thanks everyone for joining us tonight. I'm just going to share my PowerPoint. Let's see if I can get that started. There we go. That's looking correct.
Yep, I see that.
Great. Well, so I'm going to try to answer that question, but it's going to take a little to get there. I started working on this talk when Tom invited me, and I realized I've been giving sustainability talks for over 20 years. And 20 years ago, I would have talked about how we're at a nexus point, a crossroads where we either proactively work towards sustainability or navigate our way through collapse to get there. For one way or another, we're going to have to re-enter a sustainable relationship with Earth over the long term. Of course, one path is going to be prettier than the other, one filled with gentle slopes versus a volatile series of rapid declines and perhaps some shorter recoveries, similar to the boom-bust cycles seen in ecological research. Like the proverbial prey species that arrive where there are no predators and that eat through the vegetation until they experience first a rapid population growth and then a collapse. Like the reindeer made famous by Paul Hawken in the Ecology of Commerce of St. Matthew Island, where they were introduced to this island and they spiked, there were no predators, up to 6,000 and consumed so much of the grassland that they crashed completely. There was no rebound in this case. But today, I can't give that talk anymore. That was in 2005, 2010. I think I was still giving that talk, maybe even 2013. But today, we have already stepped off the cliff. We don't have a choice anymore. We're past that crossroads. We're just waiting for gravity to kick in at this point. And for many parts of the world, gravity has already taken hold in the forms of extreme droughts and floods, crop failures, famines, fires, and the political destabilization that can come with any or all of these. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, the president-designate of the next climate summit taking place in Brazil this coming year noted that COP30 will therefore be the first to undeniably take place at the epicenter of the climate crisis. The image that I used for this slide, I just had to include it because ironically, 2 days after this letter came out, there was a BBC article that talked about how the Para state government in Brazil is going to pave a 4-way highway straight through the Amazon rainforest in order to create a path to get to the climate summit. So, of course, they already had intentions of building this since 2012, and they're using the climate summit as an excuse. But just because we say things in fancy letters doesn't mean we're actually internalizing the messages that we say. But so we continue at this moment to live in record-setting times. Year after year, the world will get warmer, more unstable, more destructive for generations to come, due to the long lag in climate systems, in other environmental systems, in systems we don't even know how we've disrupted, whether we're talking about forever chemicals or microplastics or who knows, even AI. There are so many different ways that we're playing with the system that they could have long and rippling effects for generations. In fact, the World Meteorological Organization just this past week published its annual State of the Global Climate Report, and we transcended 1.5 degree Celsius average temperature globally several years earlier than projected, with global near-surface temperatures now the warmest they've been in 800,000 years. Sea level is rising faster than projected, twice as fast in the past decade as the one before it. Ocean temperatures are also the warmest on record, and the world experienced 152 unprecedented extreme weather events last year. Now, I didn't even know what unprecedented meant, so I had to look that up. But in this context, it means disasters that are worse than any ever recorded in the region. So, 152 record-breaking disasters last year. And finally, and more displacements of people since 2008. So a multiple record set in 2024, just in the climate realm. And that's going to be, a regular event, record after record after record. And instead of making bold changes, we here in the US, the second largest emitter of greenhouse gases globally, and the first largest, adding up all historical emissions, are actually leaving global climate agreements, dismantling our climate policies and our environmental programs, shutting down our climate change tracking systems, even scrubbing any climate references from the Department of Homeland Security. As if we pretend climate change is not a threat to security, it won't be. So yes, we are acting like the proverbial ostrich, hoping that if we ignore the problem, it'll go away. But in reality, we've entered a new stage in human civilization, the global polycrisis. Now, if this is a new term for you, you're lucky. But it's a pretty self-explanatory term once you hear it. It's simply the convergence of many simultaneous and interacting crises, which can play off and exacerbate each other. This complex image is more just for decoration. It's the global risks landscape from a World Economic Forum report, but it just shows how many different and interacting risks and how they can really almost play into a positive feedback loop. When one causes a problem, triggers the next, and they oscillate together and can actually exacerbate each other. I actually just finished an article for the journal Global Sustainability for an upcoming special issue on the polycrisis. And I don't say that in a humble brag as much as I now realize, because World Watch was not all about doing journal articles. And boy, I understand why. They are not easy. But it was a great process in that I got a chance to interact with some of the polycrisis experts through that process and got to look at different strategies to reduce suffering in the polycrisis period, but what I also called the post-polycrisis period. right? We're so focused typically on navigating the polycrisis that we forget to consider what comes after. But most likely, even in the most severe scenarios, there will be still humans living, even if the worst polycrises scenarios play out. It may be a tiny percentage of the current population, but even if it's just 1%, that's still a global civilization of about 80 million people, which is the global population in 500 BC. Right? So this is not, this is not prehistoric times. This is a time where we had cities and civilization and technology. But I'm optimistic that making some smarter choices, we can sustain a larger population and ideally avoid the full devastation of the biosphere, preventing the extreme degradation of the many other non-human species that are also often ignored in polycrisis analyses. So what are the ways to increase the odds of reducing suffering during both the polycrisis and the post-polycrisis period? This here is the chart from my journal article. We have the 4 quadrants, not effective in doing either, in making the polycrisis less bad or making a better post-polycrisis period. The bottom right corner has it helps with both, and then one but not the other in the other 2 quadrants. So I'll just walk through an example from each. In the helping neither quadrant, we have lots of different things. Sustainable aviation fuel, where that's actually just giving social license to encourage long distance flights. Carbon capture and storage, which literally uses energy to recapture carbon that is being released primarily by using energy. So not a very efficient strategy, but in some extreme cases, it's even worse. There was a recent project that was approved to actually bury manure, garbage, and other forms of organic waste in deep geologic storage to prevent methane releases, which they can count as positive carbon sequestering. But of course, you're taking future soils and burying them into the deep geologic storage where you'll never access those again. So it's short-sighted and profit-oriented, even assuming the greenhouse gases simply don't leak out in 50 years. And that's a huge assumption, as we're discovering with the kind of the Swiss cheese-like design of a lot of the gas fields where we've drilled so many times, where we're trying to now pump carbon dioxide back in there. We've drilled so many wells over the decades that there's going to be leakage. So if it's going to leak back out, then is it actually carbon capture? So of course, those are resources that could be used to even simply plant trees, a different and more nature-based carbon capture, but do so many more things with those resources than simply building machines that capture CO2 from the air and stick it down into wells. The second, and this is effective in making the polycrisis less bad, but not in the post-polycrisis period. Seawalls is an example I like for this one because of 2 reasons. They can, in theory, reduce the suffering, at least during the polycrisis, other than those who are displaced by the efforts. And there are many stories of seawalls displacing slums and of course, non-human species who are, again, minimally measured, if at all, in the calculations of these projects. But these only mitigate harm to a certain degree of sea level rise, which is far underestimated at this point. The Western Antarctic is all but guaranteed to collapse over a few centuries. So we're talking about many meters of sea level rise, and no seawalls can protect against that. So we're talking about a short lifespan that also is very carbon intensive, right? Steel and concrete to build these seawalls all have their own carbon impacts and are using resources in ways that could be, again, used in more ecologically restorative ways, whether that's building, replanting mangroves around the coast, or shifting economic systems away from growth, and so on. Then the third category is that it is helping the post-polycrisis, but not during. This is a really interesting quadrant and includes everything from sustaining essential discoveries and skills like sanitation, germ theory, and midwifery, which with minimal technologies and resources reduces maternal and infant mortality significantly, to maintaining a local knowledge of contaminated areas, for example, nuclear waste sites, so people don't inadvertently settle, farm, or forage there, to preventing the destruction of the deep sea, which in all probability plays key roles in both climate regulation and evolution. The deep sea may be like Earth's appendix. For those who think that your appendix is a vestigial organ, in truth, it is a backup microbiome. So when you have a disruptive event, you have a little bit of a bacteria reserve to repopulate your gut. So in the case of an asteroid or the great oxygenation event 2 billion years ago, or now our current great carbonization event, the deep sea might serve to reseed life if we really disrupt the Earth's surface. Of course, we might not feel, so hence why, and very important is to stop the destruction of the deep ocean and prevent deep sea mining through moratoriums, through prevention of financing and the mining processes. But yeah, so I think that's one example there that I wanted to point out. But they're going to be hard to fund ultimately because the benefits are hundreds or thousands of years from now, or at least multiple lifetimes away, unlike addressing the polycrisis. The fourth quadrant is the one that is most interesting because it achieves both and therefore is filled with opportunities that we can address both the suffering of the polycrisis and the post-polycrisis period. Population degrowth is a really easy one. Fewer people means less pressure now, and less pressure and fewer deaths later as human populations adjust to the new lower carrying capacity of our strained planet. Economic degrowth too, particularly if pursued in ways that rebuild public goods and real rooted economic activity. Back in 2014, I developed a concept for a reality TV show that would get millennials to move back in with their parents and farm there and their neighbors' yards. While it never sold, we did recruit a half dozen participants and even made a pitch reel. Essentially, it was a Trojan horse for degrowth. Not something we shared in the pitch reel, of course, but it had multiple complementary goals, including increasing the number of people in oversized American homes, turning unsustainable lawns, which are the 5th largest crop in America by acreage, into sustainable, community-rooted farms, addressing obesity and food insecurity, increasing community resilience, both by increasing social connections and local economic activities, especially as the world destabilizes. And most importantly, extracting a generation from the formal consumer economy, reducing their discretionary incomes and their ability to purchase earth-destroying luxuries, from travel to consumer goods to pets. Now, as the project showed, it is essential that we transform cultures in ways that makes living sustainably as natural as living as a consumer feels today. In 2010, as Tom mentioned, I looked at that systematically in our State of the World 2010 report. But the data kept developing over the years. At first, it was kind of an off-the-cuff analysis in the 2010 report of what a one planet population might entail, around 2 billion people. But the more in 2013, we commissioned an article that really looked at a one planet way of life. And then actually I helped edit a report in 2019 with the Hot or Cool Institute that looked at what it would take to keep within 2 degrees Celsius of global temperature increases. Not even 1.5 degrees, but 2 degrees, which is a lower bar. What was fascinating is that even India would have to reduce their consumption 43%, Brazil 59%, China 73%, Finland 87%. And they strategically chose to omit the United States because the numbers would be so high that they just didn't feel like it would be productive to include. But can you imagine if someone said to you that you have to cut your consumption by 87%? It's hard to even imagine how, even if you were willing. It is possible. The data kind of shows how you pull it down. You'd have to stop flying, stop driving, eating much, much less meat, stop owning pets. I know a few know my views on pet ownership, and it's not because I don't like them. It's just that they use a lot of resources. Increase the number of people in your home, maintain your clothes and stuff for decades. Basically what I was advocating in Yard Farmers. But imagine the reaction to that being forced on people. That's what's going to be necessary, but it is never going to be accepted intentionally, productively in that, going back to that first crossroads. We're not going to choose the gentle slope downwards of less and less stuff. It's going to be only accepted when it's the only option. But what can be done is mobilizing a smaller cohort of cultural pioneers, those who understand that the polycrisis is now here and that by instilling a deep respect and deference for the living earth and an understanding that we are utterly dependent on the system for our continued well-being, we might be able to rebuild in a way that prevents yet another cycle of boom and bust and the suffering that will inevitably go with it. That's where I put much of my energy today and my time as I work to craft a Gaian philosophy and a community of individuals who understand that a good life means living in a way that sustains and heals the living earth. For humans are part of and utterly dependent on this planetary system. I started realizing this was necessary around 2013. The theme of State of the World that year was, is sustainability still possible? We didn't really answer that question, but instead answered 3 related sub-questions. What is sustainability anyway? How do we get to sustainability if we choose to? Because we are already starting to recognize that this was an exercise of imagination. And what do we do if we choose not to? A section we called Open in Case of Emergency. In that section, I explored in one chapter, how could the environmental movement be more effective? My conclusion was inspired by a quotation from ecologian Martin Palmer. Environmentalists have stolen fear, guilt, and sin from religion, but they have left behind celebration, hope, and redemption. Having been a psychology and religious anthropology major, it isn't surprising that I thought about what the environmental movement could learn from missionary religions, considering they are the most successful and enduring organizations and philosophies throughout history, navigating radically different geographies, technologies, and political and economic structures. Could environmentalism reorganize in a way that it could be an enduring force of change for thousands of years, rather than a sideline political movement, always a 3rd or 4th priority? In 2013, I argued that this type of movement could build connection and community, provide mutual aid to get through the polycrisis, although at that time I didn't know the word yet, and work toward building an eco-centric civilization on the other side. For several years after that, I looked for something along these lines to join, but failing to find it in 2019, I created a simple website and started sharing writings about the Gaian way. That is, living in a way where we recognize that we are part of and utterly dependent on the living earth, and use our life energy to heal Earth's systems and to rehabilitate humans' relationships with this interwoven community of life. These past 6 years have been a process of cultural exploration, community building, and philosophizing. And while I certainly have not figured anything out, I do feel that I've learned a lot, including finally helping to answer the question you all came here tonight to hear answered. What might cultures look like 1,000 years from now? Ultimately, it comes down to what are deemed to be society's purpose. Right now, growth, dominance, and wealth are lead drivers of cultural systems. But what would societies look like if healing and sustaining Gaia was their reason for being, for economies, for the arts, for the sciences? Imagine if instead of building a cathedral over several hundred years from stone ripped from the land, we grew our houses of worship, weaving trees together and shaping them into living art that at the same time as providing a beautiful space for contemplation and reflection, provided habitat, carbon sequestration, water filtration, food, and so many other ecological benefits. Imagine if our arts created works that brought out the beauty of nature, reminded us of our place in nature, that we're part of Gaia and utterly dependent on Gaia for our well-being. Imagine if our urban design reminded us of this too, where night skies were once again pitch black, allowing us to feel our tininess in the scale of the universe, where we could all live local connected lives, where vehicles were constrained to human-powered ones like bicycles, or perhaps special vehicles that grew and maintained themselves, being fed minimally processed regenerative biofuels. Horses. Imagine if medicine was designed to sustain health, not treat symptoms, in ways that used as few resources as possible, that relied on natural symbiotic relations within our bodies to address disease. Imagine if our sciences devoted themselves to extending Gaia's lifespan, so that even as the sun increased its temperature, Earth could adapt beyond what might be its natural range to thrive an extra several hundred million years as a home for life. Of course, after we heal all the damage and bring our climate back to a stable one. But, working towards a deeper and deeper vision, an ecocentric purpose. None of these are outside our technical capabilities, even now. They're just not priorities or even on the radar for most growth-obsessed cultures. But it doesn't have to be that way. Cultivating a group of ecocentric individuals who understand we've stepped off the cliff and are plunging into the polycrisis, and that a certain group of activities could help reduce suffering during this period and set up a better pathway out, one that could help set the foundation for ecocentric civilizations for millennia to come, is key. Of course, none of this is guaranteed. The most likely post-polycrisis scenario is one where the worst of humanity comes back into play. Autocracy, slavery, warlords dominating and depopulating local subjects, new empires fighting to rule the remaining trash heaps. And we see many examples of that through recent history, ancient history, even, the capital of Haiti is a case study in the kind of devolution of warlordism. But having a vision of what an ecocentric civilization could be like, what Christians call a city on the hill, maybe I would say not a ecocentric city, perhaps a a natural park on the hill is a first step, though only a first step. The key next step is to work toward developing community, creating local hubs that can help pick up the pieces in the regions they are in, sustaining key knowledge from basic medicine, including contraception and midwifery, meditation and martial arts, to the permaculture and earth sciences, and mobilizing folks around these areas to pursue a vision of earth reverence and earth deference. Providing mutual aid, community, a sense of purpose in the dark times to come will also be key, as will certain rituals, celebrations, practices that can help as well. My Gaian community encourages meditating 3 times a day in nature, at morning, noon, and evening, which improves well-being and mindfulness and physical health. We also fast with the full and new moon, reducing our ecological impacts and increasing our resilience even in the face of shortages. And we celebrate because, as Martin Palmer noted, we have to have celebration. We celebrate the wheel of the year to punctuate our annual journey around the sun. These kinds of practices will increase ecocentric individuals' odds of survival, which may in turn increase the chances of bringing about an ecocentric future. In fact, sociologist Rodney Stark examined that in depth regarding ancient Christians. During early plagues, Christian populations grew rapidly for 2 reasons. First, they helped each other get through the plague. They also helped pagans to survive. Many of those pagans converted to Christianity, both because of the kindness shown to them, as well as because their own social networks were now dead. This push and pull kind of interaction. And now it's not like I'm suggesting we be that manipulative and calculating, but imagine if we ecocentric individuals hold this knowledge and share this knowledge, how valuable honest analysis of where climate disasters will affect, how to reduce risks, how to improve health through sanitation. And there are ways that even with zero technology, you can do that. A glass bottle in the sun will purify water, killing the bacteria. But if you don't know that, you're going to get sick from contaminated water. Basic vaccination or variolation, where you might not have vaccination, but exposure to a weak form of a virus can keep you alive. Giving birth safely and the art of midwifery, and the many of the other science-based bits of knowledge that may be lost in the tumult ahead. And increasingly, looking at the news, this might be in years, not centuries. The way we're treating vaccination, science, we're throwing so much of it out the window. So I can imagine a scenario to lighten it up a bit, like in the hilarious film Idiocracy, when the main character, who was in a cryogenic freeze for many, many years, comes out and is the smartest person in the future, and he convinces the people to stop watering crops with Brondo, which is a Gatorade type drink, which was of course filled with electrolytes, salts that were destroying the soil and the crops. So that's an obvious point from an ecological perspective, but not so much once that knowledge has been lost. Ecocentric individuals might become light keepers of essential knowledge in generations to come, and could even bring about a new golden age 50 generations from now, but not without vision, commitment, and action today. Thank you. I think that's enough. I wanted to leave
Thank
lots
you.
of time for questions.
Thank you, Eric. A lot to think about here. Amy, do you know how we go about fielding questions? We have some time
We have
left.
about 15 minutes left, right? So I don't know if you had a couple questions you planned to ask from the beginning, just to get the conversation going, or if people in the audience have questions.
I'll see if people from the audience first have questions. Where would I see that?
Oh, there's one. Rory Turner has his hand up.
Okay, Rory.
Hey, first of all, thank you, Eric. That was just very hard to hear in a way, but beautifully expressed. And I love the fact that you're really thinking. I mean, I think we talk about empathy, and what I think we tend to do is to limit our circles of empathy, to our family, and then see those outside of our family as, the other to either, make peace with or to take advantage of. Maybe we have wider circles of empathy to, people like us or nations even. But you're really inviting a different scope of empathy, an empathy for those that come after us, who are will be no less suffering than those that might be close to us if they are suffering, and no less deserving of love. So I wanted to just open up one possible way of thinking about this, and it's related to notions of cultural sustainability, I think, in some ways, that we learned from the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss that one of the main work of culture is to define what culture and what nature is. And so how do we do that? Well, we do that through the work of the complex orchestration of myth, but we also do that through what we could call ritual. I think of that as the transmission and sort of embodyingness of the deeper meanings that guide how we naturally, culturally interact with the world. It seems to me that there's ways here that thinking about culture's possibility as offering a different version than the version that's embedded within consumerism is really important. One of the things that's kind of a signature of Goucher's program is that we see in traditional cultures inspiration and something worth fighting for in terms of these other ways of thinking about the world, thinking about ontology, thinking about epistemology. So I'm just curious about, that thinking about those dimensions of sustainability and of this, sort of like the mammals, scurrying around between the cracks of the dinosaurs. I think there's a sort of parallel here of a different way of living on the planet within the context of what is dominant now, the ways that culture and things like cultural celebration, festivals. I helped organize something called the Baltimore Rhythm Festival, and the sort of esoteric meaning of that is we need to really connect up with these rhythms that are part of our creativity, but also part of the natural cycles that really shape, constrain, support, and nurture us.
I think just to comment quickly, ritual is so powerful. And I mean, I think I was called to this path in part because I spent too many years at World Watch interacting with environmentalism purely cerebrally. And I missed my religious and ritualistic interactions. I grew up Christian. And so having that again, through meditation practices, all built, around this Gaian structure, has given a lot of joy, right? That ritual way of learning, the practices, and some experimentation too. I mean, I think knowing that this is not based on the word of a higher being, but on our interaction with the living system that we depend on, there's a little bit more creative freedom that you can have, and we've experimented with, the moon fasting and the daily nature meditations. Some we've tried and they haven't stuck. I married a friend, I mean, as the officiant, and created a little. It was called wedding strings, right? And just a 3 braid string instead of a wedding ring, which was very fragile, right? I mean, it has about a 3 month length of time, maybe 6 months if you're careful, before it falls apart. But that gave that moment to revisit one's relationship, right? So it's like, the ring is permanent, but no relationship is permanent. And so giving that free hand of thinking, how can we think creatively, not just about green weddings and green funerals, which are important, but rethink how the symbolism of a wedding and the marriage relationship can be in service to improving our relationships over and over. Right. So I feel like this has been a little bit of a space where we can, you know, think out of the box about some of the rituals and institutions that we don't think about too often.
Okay, good. Erik, I had a couple of questions. One is sort of in the weeds about nuclear power, nuclear energy, which we've talked about before. I think we probably disagree a little bit.
A little bit.
And the role of dogs in our lives is maybe the only things we disagree about.
How about nuclear powered dogs?
Yeah, yeah. And also then just on a kind of intergalactic scale, another question. But I wanted to start by just acknowledging how influential you've been for my thinking in our program at Goucher by kind of secretly or surreptitiously and silently sending me an article in one of the early editions of the World Watch Report by Michael Maniates called Teaching for Turbulence, which I think is as relevant now as it was, over almost 20 years ago, over 20 years. One of the points I think he makes is that emergencies or crises really are sort of situations that make bad policy. We have to sort of get through that, put aside some of the political motivations that, are operating sometimes to develop rescue efforts or relief efforts or some kind of policy, and really think about things with a different theory of sustainability. So that said, I'm just thinking, are there different kinds of strategies maybe in your quadrant table where we can think about a role for nuclear power, particularly in the context of a neoliberal dominance and focus on growth, where people just want more and more energy? It's like, how do we turn that around? Maybe there's a way to introduce, nuclear power as an alternative to be able to supply people the sort of, baseload energy needs, but also managing a kind of sustainability in that process. So that was, I think, one question I just wanted to hear you reflect a little bit more on.
Yeah, and I'm not as black and white with nuclear as you might think. I I remember writing about the Nunn-Lugar Act back when the Soviet Union fell. The U.S. bought up and secured nuclear missiles and de-enriched that uranium to use for our nuclear reactors. I do not disagree that we should use the nuclear reactors that we have, like Germany and Japan shutting them down. other than where there was a serious tsunami risk, seems a little bit dangerous with the climate moment we're in. Not a little bit, it seems short-sighted. But the idea of building new nuclear plants, or even kicking back on old shuttered ones like 3 Mile Island, seems counterproductive. Especially with the Ukrainian conflict, I do not think the U.S. is going to be a stable long-term country. I don't know if it'll break into pieces. I don't know if it will become aggressive and more imperialistic. Those are things I have no knowledge of. But looking at the Soviet Union, there's no way that the states are going to turn over all of the nuclear weapons to Russia, like all the satellites returned the nuclear weapons to Russia, which is good or bad, I don't know. But the more nuclear weapons sites and the more nuclear waste sites and the more nuclear reactors that are there, they become future fortresses. I mean, you see that in Ukraine. The Russians are occupying nuclear reactors. The supply of electricity, when it's disrupted, has almost caused nuclear accidents several times. The Russian soldiers are literally digging into Chernobyl, causing sickness to themselves, to the local populations. We're not smart enough to manage nuclear power, even in this stable moment. And in 500 years, when we've forgotten so much of our technologies, because I do not think we're going to go in a nice positive upward curve, if you haven't caught that already. So I just think that nuclear has only has way more downsides than positives. Even I included in the upper right quadrant, uh, offshore wind turbines, large wind turbines, because the amount of technology needed to maintain offshore wind is so significant that if they, if our technology systems or our civilizations fail, those will just be like Easter Island heads at one point. They'll just be these weird monoliths in the ocean that nobody will understand what they were even for. I'm not saying that small scale wind and solar and all those things. I think if we can build circular renewable technologies, gravity fed storage systems, including, battery storage systems, especially non-toxic ones, iron-based batteries, all that stuff. That's going to be the future. Renewables are already way cheaper than nuclear. And I think, it's the political systems, the lobbying systems that keep nuclear going forward, and the extreme obsession with energy that we're seeing in tech companies and data center driven, this AI boom, which I think all of that is a wrong direction anyway. We don't want to be an AI world where we're all hooked up to social media and phones. That is not sustainable in any future.
We have a couple of questions. First from Carter and then Lori.
Yeah, I was just typing it out, but now I forgot my hand was still raised. Yeah, awesome. Thank you guys so much. This is, I think more than anything, I'm grateful to have at any time the opportunity to rekindle personal efforts, personal thought, how I can do things on a day-to-day or just in general. Anyways, moving on to my question. It's kind of, so outside of the word of mouth or religious legacy, how do you think we might create lasting messages for generations, which might be altogether alien from what we can effectively account for? Like, I think of the designs that at one point, we did seem to care an awful lot and ones for coming up with things for nuclear waste sites and how to communicate with societies, which, we'd have to overcome language barriers and how color would be perceived in cultures we can't count or how they think. So like in that line, but like I really loved how part of your Gaia message was, it was more on the proactive side. So spreading, you know, positive insights about technology, how to retweak a way of thinking and just a better, more um, ecologically minded way of thinking, rather than the warning kind of bah humbug depression that some of the other, I mean, that's what they found with the nuclear waste site. Anything, it was just like scare tactics in the end that could be universally identified theoretically. And then I guess to cap that is, assuming a culture that just comes after the decline of ours, there's 1% or less, survive, and they come along and they're evolving politically in their own way. What are the risks of leaving behind technological artifacts? Like, is the risk reward, if we're trying to do something good that could potentially or inadvertently redirect, a society that's already going in a good way. So thanks again.
Yeah, thanks. Those are interesting questions. The second reminds me of Planet of the Apes, the original, where there were clear taboos by the ape society to not go into the human areas, so that there would be no spread of these dangerous technologies or knowledge base. It's tough. I mean, Joanna Macy says it really well about nuclear guardianship, and I do think, if you look at what institutions survive, right, it's the Buddhists have been around for 2,500 years, 1,500 years Islam, 2,000 years Christianity. They could play a key role in holding on to nuclear scar knowledge, right? Generation after generation, they could be saying, do not farm here, do not settle here, do not, even go through here. And I think the word of mouth in the couple 100-year time frame, the 500-year time frame, even 1,000-year time frame could be what is essential. Signs probably aren't going to work, but I do think we have resources now, and Finland has done a great job in securing. They literally convinced an island full of residents to make their island home to a long-term repository. They trust the government. There's government trust there, and they built a repository that is a safe way to hold on to nuclear waste, probably for several thousand years. So the ideal is that we clean up our mess and we bury it as deep as it goes in a place where it's not going to migrate back up to the surface, because no parish or even religious group is going to be, foolproof in keeping the word about nuclear scars, or even just PFAS scars, or whatever chemical dangers there are. But we're dismantling all, Superfund and EPA and the rest of it. So I don't think we're going to do that here. But in Europe, at least, they would be wise to secure their nuclear waste as quickly and as efficiently as possible, so that when systems break down, they'll have less to worry about.
Thank you, Lori. Lori Hedrick, you have your hand up.
Yeah, hi, this is Gary Hedrick, and I'm sorry I can't use my video right now, but Lori and I participated, we were actually the subjects of a documentary on nuclear waste at San Onofre. It's called
yeah.
San Onofre Syndrome, and I put it in the chat. But I agree with everything I've heard about the nuclear analysis you're just given, Eric, and the movie really emphasizes that, but it concludes more on the end of rolling stewardship, which I think you were kind of alluding to, where one generation has the option of repackaging the nuclear waste if we have to, if it's still not a permanent solution available. And that rolling stewardship will allow us to come up with a much better permanent solution, because we're not even sure if deep geologic is going to work.
Mhm.
We're hoping it will, but we have to plan on maybe it's not going to work. And we need, that's why I was interested in your 1,000-year perspective too. Is if we give generation after generation an opportunity to discover something totally unthought of right now. I mean, the person's probably not even born yet, but it could turn this into something that I'm really excited about. And I'm not a professional in this, although I've got like 15 years experience in it because whistleblowers brought my wife and I into this. Anyway, the story is best told in the documentary I'm talking about, but what we do these screenings and we don't like to leave people feeling hopeless. And the point about rolling stewardship is, yeah, well, we can at least keep it moving forward. But what I'm excited about now is the University of Ohio just came out with a discovery that you can expose crystals to radiation that's just sitting there in storage. The radiation will illuminate the crystals in a way that radiation from the sun works on solar panels.
Hmm.
You would have this 24/7, however many years nuclear waste is going to be around. I mean, it's just exciting to think in my own lifetime what's been developed. And I think they've already proven it's doable. It sounds like we're kind of at the point where solar was when we weren't generating that much productivity from the first solar panels, and look how it advanced so quickly. And just think if the same thing could happen with nuclear waste, where instead of it being a burden on society, it's actually an answer to maybe all of our energy needs, if you really want to push your imagination 1,000 years out, But I'm not saying, and I don't like to say it in a forum where, screening the movie and all that so much, make people feel like I'm giving false hopes. But I just want people to start using their imaginations while we give them time to figure this out. Because I'm not sure there is going to be a good solution. And the whole movie the point is what's happening at San Onofre is happening at 74 other places across the country where we're using temporary canisters, and they're going to expire if we don't do something quick. Sorry for taking so long, Will.
Just to
Thanks.
follow up on that, Rory posted, I think, a link to a documentary film from maybe 15 years ago called Into Eternity. And one of the interesting things there about the rolling stewardship idea is that, in the scale of time that we're talking about, what happens when people, sort of lose the language maybe that's used over a long period of time, or really lose concepts too about what this danger is, and they stumble upon it and release something that, is despite all the intentions of the current efforts, are then lost. So interesting analog too.
And I think that goes back to Rory's early comment too, where ritual will become essential, right? I can imagine if those crystals work, maybe they'll be the official necklace of the nuclear guardians, right? They glow when they're there, but they might have certain rituals that contain those areas and regularly, annually remind people in a kind of some sort of scary ritual or placating ritual. I don't know what it would look like, but that's the work of science fiction writers. Where does this go? How do we embed this in non intellectual ways so that it lasts through cultural transmission, even when we've lost sciences?
Mm-hmm.
It kind of gives me hope if just thinking there's something positive. If we're receiving a benefit from it, it's much more likely we'll care for it than we will if it's just a burden on us. That gives me hope.
Well, and even, the ritual of fasting on the new moon and the full moon, Eric, it's sort of a sacrifice, right? But it's a ritual, it's an affirming ritual. And, you know, even little behaviors like that can make a difference, can change your own perception, I think, about how you are interacting with the world around you. And, you know, and then you share that and spread that even wider. So,
That's right. And it turns out that it becomes less of a sacrifice over time. It becomes
Yeah.
almost joyful. I mean, there's lots of science now on the medical and health benefits of fasting. But there's also a community aspect where, you know, we have a text chain where we connect with each other as we fast. So we're not doing it alone, but in solidarity. And you just feel better after you've done it. And yes, when you multiply it out, it's 24 times 24 365ths less food over a course of a year. So that
for
adds
one
up
person.
for one person. Yeah.
Yeah.
That
So,
adds
so, you know, how does one join the Gaian Way?
It's easy. It's not like Fight Club or something. It's you just have to sign up for the newsletter and join some of our online conversations. If you live in New Orleans or Middletown or Honolulu, we have a few local guilds where we gather weekly or monthly for you know, forest gatherings or nature ceremonies. But you know, there's lots of opportunities online. And a few in person. And over time, I hope, because yeah, Tom and I, before this conversation started, before people joined, we were talking about John Michael Greer, and you know, he writes a great piece on Dark Age America, and makes the point that the internet might not survive. So to create a community only online is not resilient. So, you know, building local communities based in geographies is essential. You know, that's a step for our future. It's much more challenging, but right now we do have at least a couple of events every month. You know, some kind of more celebratory. Sometimes we have book discussions, and on and on. So if you look at guyandway.org, there's an upcoming events page. Thanks for
Great,
asking.
thanks.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I have to say that, you know, every time I read your articles that we have our students read, and now tonight listening to you talk, I always get inspired, even though there's this very kind of gloomy, scary part of what you're talking about. You're very good at also providing, you know, that sort of inspiration to actually change my behavior, you know, to find ways. And I was thinking, when you showed that picture, you know, you went from Notre Dame to the cathedral that was built. My grandfather did that when I was a little girl. He had a farm, and he built a cathedral out of pine trees, and it just immediately took me there, brought tears to my eyes. You know, it was this like really beautiful cathedral in the forest with an altar at the front that was made out of trunks of wood and stuff like that, you know. So it, you know, I totally believe that we need to make this shift from success being defined by wealth to success being defined by well-being. And you know, and I think that's at the core of the cultural sustainability program, and you know, as your readings have been. So
Yeah.
you know, being mindful of our time. If anybody does anybody else have a question or a comment that they want to make sure they get in? I don't want to leave anybody without the opportunity to ask Erik a question. No? Okay.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Erik, and thank you, Tom, so much for, contact for Erik. Yeah, Erik, do you want to put your
Sure.
contact information in the
Yeah,
chat?
I can do that. It's easy enough. Erik@guyandway.org.
There you go.
I will write it down.
I think unless you are, we're gonna about to get a bunch of new members, maybe.
Well, thank you, Amy and Tom, again, and everyone for joining. I see some new faces, but also many who we've had the chance to interact over the years, and some of the Gaian community. So thank you, everybody, for
Great.
joining tonight.
Great.
you.
Will this
Yeah,
be
and,
I
so
have
if
a
any,
question. Can I ask a
yeah,
question?
Rory, got your,
Will this be available online afterwards?
yes,
I'd love to share it
thank
with
you.
some folks.
Yeah, I mentioned that at the very beginning, but that probably not everybody was here. We will put this recording onto our YouTube page, so people will have access to it. You can go back and look at some of those slides, get that quote from the one quote you put up there that talks about don't forget culture, right? Don't forget the rituals and the traditions.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you all very much. Again, next week on Monday evening, we'll be having a why cultural sustainability conversation about the graduate program and why cultural sustainability matters. So a good next conversation after this one. So
Erik, thank you,
thank you.
and we'll be in touch.
Sounds great. Thanks, everybody.